I'm going to get started now. As I said before we begin our presentation, I would like to take a moment to read the UW-Madison Land Acknowledgement Statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Duch since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. And just to talk a little bit about what the statement I just read, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. In the words of UW-Madison Chancellor Rebecca Blank, for many years, UW-Madison was not mindful of this history, and we paid little attention to our relationship with the descendants of those who were here long before us, but we are working to change that. As we consider the global instances of genocide covered during today's workshop, it is important to remember that the dispossession, removal, and state-sanctioned acts of genocide against Indigenous people in the US are not confined to the past, and that many of the challenges Indigenous communities face today can be traced back to this violence. With that being said, I am going to turn everything over to Mary McCoy to introduce the workshop.
Good morning. Welcome everybody to our workshop today, Empowering Educators to Teach on Genocide. I would like to begin by thanking some of our partners. We have an incredible group who had worked hard to bring this to you today. And the larger picture for all of them is that all of the UW-Madison Area Studies Centers who make up the Wisconsin International Resource Consortium are bringing this to you today from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, representing many parts of the world. And then I would also like to thank the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education and Resource Center, and we will have Sam Goldberg of HERC speak tomorrow. And then last but not even remotely least, the tremendously supportive Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. So thank you to everybody who made this possible. And then I would also like to thank all of you today who are participants, who are attending, for taking what scarce time you have to be here. And we know your time is scarce. A key reason, in fact, we're bringing these presentations and resources and panel discussions to you is that we greatly value what you do every day. And of course, weekends as well, as we know just from your presence here today. We value what you do for our kids and for all of us, including taking on the vital teaching of Wisconsin students on these difficult subjects. And we hope with this workshop to make your jobs a little easier. To this end, we have designed the workshop to bring you presentations and interactive sessions within the shortest possible time frame. By necessity, therefore, we will be moving fairly quickly from one talk to the next, providing a 10-minute break between the first two talks, a 30-minute break in the middle, from 10:45 to 11:15, and then a 10-minute break tomorrow, at the end of the day today between the last two talks, with the goal of ending by 1 p.m. After each 30-minute talk today, we will have about 15 minutes for questions. And today we're using a Zoom webinar format, allowing you two ways to ask questions, and we'll discuss that more when we get to the Q&A for the first talk. Tomorrow we'll be using a Zoom meeting format, and that will allow you to interact more directly with each other and the speakers. Finally, to allow you to speak more freely, we will not be recording the Q&A sessions or the teacher-led panel discussion tomorrow. So we'll be recording the talks and the presentations, and you can then access those later to refresh your memories or share them with friends. But today and tomorrow, we will not be recording the Q&A. We hope to give you information, discussion, and tips to help you determine both how and how not to teach on the subject of the workshop. But I'll end this introduction with 3 answers to the question of why. Why teach on these cases, and why teach on something as profoundly upsetting and deeply disturbing as genocide. First, teaching on genocide has been shown to foster empathy toward others, particularly teaching through stories about and stories told by survivors. This is why we are trying to get book sets to you that tell stories so that you can then share them with your students. Second, whether willfully or by default, forgetting is the human condition. I was struck by a quote I saw about Putin's recent ban of Memorial. This is a group that chronicled political repression under the Soviet Union. They are trying to erase our memory. There is a feeling that they are trying to paint over something, over what happened then, so that we cannot compare it with what's happening now. This quote is about learning from the past so that we don't repeat it, but it brings me to a final and somewhat different note. Although this workshop presents cases that invite comparison, I have learned something that may be helpful in the present moment. And that is that there is no need to make comparisons between the cases explicitly or risk backlash through comparing cases to politically sensitive situations close to home. Students will inevitably make comparisons. It is one of the principal ways we learn, but it is not absolutely necessary to do so because helping students understand one case all on its own is a path to understanding larger, often universal phenomena the cases illustrate, such as the extraordinary power of simply language, that dehumanizes or creates categories of exclusion, or generates what one study calls the rhetoric of non-belonging. And this is a quote that I put up from David Simon, who's the director of the very famous Yale Genocide Studies program. But this language that creates these kinds of phenomena are very familiar to today's students. So these are just some of the many reasons why we need to teach on this dark, troubling subject. But I'll end by noting that although our speakers are all renowned experts in their respective fields, you are actually the front line, the most important people in bringing this knowledge and these cases to the next generation. And so each speaker is planning to address specifically how to teach each case to students. With that in mind, it is my great pleasure to introduce our highly distinguished and truly amazing keynote speaker, Alexander Hinton. Dr. Hinton is a distinguished professor of anthropology, the director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, and the UNESCO Chair in Genocide Prevention. He is the author or editor of 16 books, including most recently, It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. And he is also the author of another book, which is the focus of today's talk, and it is titled Man or Monster, The Trial of a Khmer Rouge Torturer. And I will put a link to a free PDF of this book, which I just learned about yesterday, in the chat. For his work on genocide, he received the Robert B. Textor and Family Prize for Excellence in Anticipatory Anthropology and has served as president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and as co-convener of the Global Consortium on Bigotry and Hate. His next book, Anthropological Witness, centers on the 2016 experience testifying as an expert witness at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Alex Hinton.
Hello, hi. Thanks so much for that generous welcome. It's good to be here with you today. So I'm going to run for about exactly 30 minutes. I'm going to put myself on the clock, and I am going to share a PowerPoint to guide my discussion. And I have some music for you as well to begin as I set up here. So that was the Khmer Rouge national anthem, which talks about blood being spilled in the name of revolution. And I will get into that shortly. But I want to begin again just by thanking, first of all of you for the incredible work that you do, And I wanted to thank Professor McCoy for a generous introduction and for inviting me to speak, as well as Director Lindkert, as well as Eleanor Conrad and everyone else that's been involved. I know from directing a center that these sorts of things take an enormous amount of effort, and I'm very appreciative of it. So today I'm going to organize my remarks around 4 themes: a picture, a fire, a boulder, and a frame. So I want to begin with a question: what do you see? So when I sometimes teach on different topics, including the Cambodian genocide, I sometimes begin with this question and invite students to sort of begin. They say, a man with glasses, so on and so forth. But if you were talking about this man in Cambodia and talked to his students, for example, he was a math teacher in Cambodia. People referred to him as a beloved teacher, a person who was kind and gentle, someone who never got angry, someone who helped students by buying school materials for them in the rural countryside where students didn't have money and couldn't afford to get books, paper and pencils, so on and so forth. But now I'll ask the question again: what do you see now? And again, when I ask this in classes, people will suddenly see the shift and they'll say someone who is in some sort of carceral institution, the guard behind them, maybe they'll say someone important. But this picture, and I apologize, one of the quotes is gone, is a picture of Duch. He was the head of a Khmer Rouge interrogation and torture center, and in the blank space, which with erasure and different thematics is maybe appropriate, it was a quote from a witness who said that he saw Duch personally. He said nothing could happen at the prison unless Duch gave instructions, and then he described how he saw Duch walk up and torture someone who was hanging upside down from a tree. A witness described him as a madman. Witnesses talked about how he used youth. So he's a former teacher. He's using people who are in the young teenagers as soldiers, interrogators, messengers. And eventually he also turned a high school into a security and torture center. And he converted classrooms into cells and torture chambers. So this reading of Duch is the monster reading. There's the quote I had before. And it sort of was posed in a headline in 2009 that ran in the Phnom Penh Post, a Cambodian newspaper, that said, "Comrade Duch, man or monster." That is the frame of my remarks today. And as Professor McCoy noted, free book, right? Everybody likes free books. This book is open access at that link, which I believe is posted into the chat. I can't see the chat, but I assume it has been. I encourage you to download it. And I'm going to refer to a few different pieces of it along the way today. Just briefly, you saw some of the historical material that I had in the first slide, but the basics, which I know most of you are aware of, but just in case. So the Cambodian genocide took place, well, the Khmer Rouge, or a radical group of Marxist-Leninists, Maoist-inspired revolutionaries, led by Pol Pot and brother number 2, Nguyen Gia. Anyways, from 1975 to 1979, under 4 years, they enacted policies that resulted in the death of almost a quarter of the population, somewhere between 1.7 to 2.2 million people. Duch headed the S-21 prison, which operated directly under the control of Pol Pot, Nguyen Gia, and the Khmer Rouge leaders. And during his trial, they came up with the number that just over 12,000 people perished there, many after torture, but because records were lost, the numbers are much higher. And afterwards, a few of you may have even gone to Cambodia and visited the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocidal Crimes, which is built on the site of S21. And the last piece, which I'm going to get into in a moment, is that a tribunal is now ongoing in Cambodia, and Duch was tried there. So who was Duch? As I said before, he was a former math teacher. He was ethnic Chinese, and he joined the Khmer Rouge in '67, though he'd become interested in Marxist-Leninism before that. During the revolution that was being fought as the Vietnam War was taking place, and that was one of the events that destabilized Cambodia, he became the head of prison M13, and then eventually in '76 was appointed to be the head of S21, which was the main interrogation and torture center operating in Phnom Penh. During a psych evaluation, he got a lot of background information. He talked about moments that turned him towards revolution. He talked about an inspirational teacher. That teacher, ironically, would come back and be one of the people who was tortured under his supervision and killed at the prison. He talked about the visit of a Chinese leader, and at that time he sort of, because ethnic Chinese had often been discriminated against, he began to have pride in his ethnic Chinese background. But he also talked about an uncle who, in terms of money lending, put his family in a very difficult position. This was commonplace in the countryside with a very large amount of indebtedness at the time. Right before he joined the revolution, he talked about events, the romantic disappointment, the theft of a bicycle, which means he couldn't ride to the university. And then a bunch of his friends were arrested by the government, a bunch of revolutionaries. And so this is his path in '68 to joining the revolution. So the question is, after '68, through the end of the Khmer Rouge regime in 1979, what exactly did he do? And this was the question that was taken up by the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. That's what everyone calls it. The official name is the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. I've spent a great deal of time there, and I actually testified there as an expert witness and sat, as you can see, in the witness stand at this sort of directly in the center of the court facing the judges. This is a UN-backed international hybrid tribunal, meaning that it has shared the personnel between Cambodia and the UN, and you can see it there in the center photo, which was to mark the opening of the tribunal. This has posed a number of problems. I've written another book called The Justice Facade that goes into the tribunal itself. But the key point is it's a mixed tribunal with international and domestic personnel. After, you say 79 to 2003, what happened? A lot of politics, but the tribunal finally convened in 2003. It's ongoing. And a day or two ago, they finally announced that they're winding down and they're going to stop. Very few people were tried. Duch was the first person to be tried in 2009. Nuangia, Kusampan, Ing Sari, and Ing Taret were later put on trial. Ing Sari, Ing Taret died. Nuangia died, but only after receiving a genocide conviction. So the court's looking at what happened. So in legal terms, they're looking at joint criminal enterprise led by Pol Pot, Nuangia, and other leaders. And there are sort of 5 buckets of things that they did: population transfers, labor camps, group targeting, forced marriage, and security centers. And so this is where Duch comes in. You can see S21 under security centers, and he was the first person to go on trial. With the genocide, as I said before, maybe 2 million of Cambodia's 8 million inhabitants died. At the time, about half of them are thought to have been executed at security centers and killing fields. Work was done also by local militias. Others died from disease, starvation, overwork, and non-existent or minimal health care. So Duch went on trial for crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. In his trial, he was detained in 2007, and the final decision in his case was in 2012. And my book follows this. I should just note about the ECCC, they also have a website with lots of materials, video recordings, and other things, or primary original documents. So if you just put ECCC Cambodia, you'll go straight to their website. So where did he do this? He did this obviously in Cambodia. The capital is Phnom Penh. So there's a picture of Phnom Penh. This was a map that was used to mark out where S21 was. You can see it in the center of the city. There's an aerial view. You can see a compound that shows the main complex, though people were interrogated and they had offices all around the area. And this is a surviving photograph in the bottom right-hand corner of tool slaying at the time it was in use. As I mentioned before, Duch operated his prison, S21, operated directly under the authority of the party center, but there was a very hierarchical organization with security apparati everywhere throughout. And so this was part of the way in which mass death was overseen and undertaken. In terms of Duch, so he was the head of S21. This is another document from the tribunal. And he actually directly oversaw the prison in general, its operation. At one point, over 2,000 people worked there. But he also basically supervised and instructed interrogators. And some of his notebooks, which interestingly, since he was a math teacher, he called a statistics list, has compilations of his lectures about torture, how to get people to confess and torture. And so that's another document that exists. And I will return to that a little bit later. So how did Duch do this? Well, as I said before, through torture. These photographs are from the tool slaying Genocide Museum on the site of S21. They were done by a former victim, Van Nat. And the bottom right-hand corner is a photograph of his experience being tortured and shocked at one point. After producing confessions, and this is a Khmer Rouge confession, as you can see on the right side, people had to list their names and their associates, and they would go through the list, see people whose name recurred, they'll arrest that person, and so the whole thing snowballed and more people were arrested. After confessing, being interrogated and confessing, people were taken to either on the compound initially, but later via truck to a nearby killing site called Chung Ike. And again, if anyone's been to Cambodia, you've probably gone there as well, where the victims were hit in the back of the head, dumped into mass graves. And this is another portrait that's done by a former prisoner. One of the prisoners, Bu Meng, who I've written about at different points, he testified as a civil party at Duch's trial. He and his wife, as you can see in the top, these paintings are by Bu Meng, at the top center, arrived at the gates of S21. Like other prisoners, they were taken, basic biographical information was taken at the prison. He was then separated from his wife. Their photographs were taken. He went first into a communal cell and then into an individual cell, which was a common practice right before people were tortured. Then he was severely tortured, beaten, whipped. And it only stopped, as you can see in the bottom center, when he produced a confession. In contrast to virtually everyone else at the prison, he survived because he could paint. He was an artist, and he and a small number of other people who had skills that were valued to Duch survived. And you can see on the bottom left side of the frame, you can see a picture of Bu Meng, who's the shortest person in the photo, with some of the other handful of survivors of the prison. Everybody else was killed. So why did Duch do this? And this takes us from our initial focus on a picture into the fire and the question, why? I don't have time to go into sort of theories of perpetrator motivation. You can group them in a way that sort of cluster around the notion of the monster and the man, to go back to the original frame and the title of the book. with things like psychodynamic reductionism, bioevolutionary reductionism, cultural reductionism, producing notions of the monster, and then you have situational reductionism, banality of evil sorts of explanations that center more on the quote unquote man part of the explanation. I've extensively studied this question, so I have the danger that I could talk forever about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to be very brief. If you're interested, as I said, I have a book called Why Did They Kill? Man or Monster. I talk about Cambodia some in my book, It Can Happen Here, and I have a book about testifying called The Anthropological Witness. And The Justice Facade is about transitional justice at the court. So anyways, further reading, further answers, but what you don't have those. Hopefully some of you have downloaded the book, Man or Monster, now that you have the link. But what I believe you received beforehand was a link to a 10-page essay that was written in a book on pre-genocides that was intended for high school students and a broad public audience. They have short 10-minute chapters on different genocides, and I wrote one on Cambodia. Excuse, there are a couple typos in there because we never got to see the final proof, so I apologize for that. As an academic, we never like those typos in there, but that is because I never saw it. So besides the typos, it's a nice, succinct introduction to the Cambodian genocide. It focuses not on Duch, but on Nguyen Gia, brother number 2, who is also the focus of my forthcoming book, Anthropological Witness, because I had a face-to-face exchange in court with Nguyen Gia when he didn't like what I had said while I was testifying. But this book talks some about that. It begins with this question, what makes a man start fires, which comes from a New York Times article about a neo-Nazi, Tony Hoveder. And the New York Times article tried to understand what was going on. They couldn't come up with an explanation, the journalist, so he ended with the quote, what makes a man start fires, from its title of a punk rock album. So that's sort of the question I use to set up, this discussion. But this essay provides, a teaching rubric that's possible to use in classes. So you go back to the sort of, Khmer Rouge, why? What led Duch or Nguyen Gia to turn to revolution and do horrible things in the name of revolution? So why did Duch do this? Well, what did he say? Now, of course, he was trying to offer a defense, and his remarks in court were informed by that defense. But he, at one point, was talking about the party, and he referred to his induction in 1967. And suddenly in court, he stood up and he went and gave a revolutionary salute as he recounted how he swore the oath to the party and to its political line. The party line was absolutely central with the Khmer Rouge. You can see Pol Pot, the head of the Khmer Rouge, at one point said, without a political line, it gives us judicious guidance. Without it, you become blind. And in his interviews that were done by the psych evaluation team, Duch at one point said, we can't live without belief. And Duch actually later converted and became an evangelical Christian after the Khmer Rouge regime fell. But this sort of fervent belief, according to him, in the party line was what drove him to do the things that he did. So the party line had 3 different components, politics, organization, and consciousness. So if we go to politics first, this was things like basic Marxist-Leninist ideology, different slogans the Khmer Rouge had, focused on class composition and defining who the enemy was. Consciousness referred to sharpening your consciousness so that it accorded with the party line. And people did this with criticism and self-criticism sessions, writing biographies, holding meetings, and as they were constantly exhorted to do, to continuously struggle to build and defend the country and destroy regressive elements. These ideas were spelled out very directly in the party statutes. And again, this is another document that's available online through the ECCC website. And Duch talked about the party statutes and saying, well, I had to obey the organizational line. Sharpening the consciousness, sometimes the Khmer Rouge talked about it, sharpening the consciousness like a hammer and anvil, forging yourself until your mind accorded with the revolutionary ideology. Organization referred to things like the restructuring of society in accordance with Marxist-Leninist ideas about the relations and forces of production, the organization of society itself, reorganizing different villages and communes into cooperatives, collectivizing everything, and then that administrative structure that I noted earlier. That was all part of the organizational line. And that gives you a sense for how things went. It was very hierarchical, straight from the party center down to communes on the local level. As I mentioned before, each of these levels had their security apparatus in ways, places where they would take people and kill them, and places where they would take people and torture them. And so again, in terms of defining enemies, you had re-education camps, security centers, and local monitoring. And these mechanisms were part of the security apparatus that led to this mass death. In terms of political ideology, the Khmer Rouge spent a great deal of time defining who we are, right? We're talking about us, our people, the army, the party, worker, peasant class, so on and so forth, as opposed to, capitalists, those with privativist sentiments. And this bifurcation, and this comes straight out of a Khmer Rouge radio broadcast and magazine tract, was used in the production of different enemies. And so in 76, history, there was a first wave of killing in 75 and 76. The Khmer Rouge thought that there were traitorous elements within that are trying to subvert the revolution, and they gave authority to quote unquote smash inside and outside the ranks. And you could see the targets, as I talked about, who are we? The enemies were targeted in different phases, including internal purges of people who were at one point said to have Khmer bodies, but Vietnamese minds. Duch at one point said, well, what does smash mean? And he goes, in terms of torturing people, basically obliterating them. He said when people arrived at the prison, they were people who were already dead. He also, in terms of his defense, produced the relay point. You can see the document on the left. At the bottom center is Duch's handwriting. It's an annotation on the confession of a person named Long Moi, who I discuss in the book. On the upper left-hand side facing you is his boss, Son Sen, and that check mark he pointed out was a check mark of Pol Pot. So again, and so there he talked about this, that basically the confessions would go up, he got his instructions, and he'd relay them down to the people below him. So he said he was a cog in the machine. We've heard that many times before. And he actually at one point recounted a French romantic poem, this quote, weeping or praying, all this is in vain. Shoulder your long and energetic task, the way of the destiny sees fit to ask, then as I do suffer and do so without complaint. So again, he has this rubric of politics, organization, consciousness, and the party line. So I want to reframe this briefly in terms of the fire metaphor, in terms of having context, which is the spark that sets the flame, politics, consciousness, and organization. And in the essay that you were sent the link to, this is what it says, what makes a man start fires. This occurs towards the end of the article. I recast that framework in terms of fictions, enterprise, loyalism, and upheaval. And again, and I teach, I sometimes use this framework as well. I just want to check, I think I'm about 4 or 5 more minutes. So this is a second sort of rubric I invite you to use. The book also on page 41 to 43 has an abecedarian, which is a poetic form that's arranged in alphabetical order with the beginning of each word starting with the letter of the alphabet. And I use that to introduce Duch. And it's a way sometimes when I teach, I also introduce Duch and the revolution. It's very short, and it's a different sort of entree into the course material. So further reading, giving you a lot that you can look at. But I want to briefly, in the 2 or 3 minutes, skim over a few last slides and move to the boulder and the frame. So in terms of the boulder, it's a reference to Adorno and his famous public address on education after Auschwitz that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And he says we need to know the mechanisms, right? So that's what I've been talking about. What are the mechanisms that lead people to participate in projects of mass violence and genocide? And he talks about, once you understand the mechanisms, you can then combat against lack of self-reflection. And he talked about reified consciousness, which is being blinded to history, to not understanding the structural forces that condition your place in society, that it's contingent, not natural. And that the goal of teaching is, in a sense, to rupture this conceptual blindness to promote critical self-reflection in contrast to reified consciousness. So again, in terms of my aim in the book, Man or Monster, throwing into question naturalized assumptions about perpetrators, historicizing that which has been dehistoricized. So that's a basic pedagogical goal. I'm not going to go into Adorno in great depth, but again, if you unpack that quotation, he wants to look at what's naturalized, dehistoricized, what's looked at reductively, decontextualized, structured by power. And he also sometimes talked about the veil of technology, which is interesting in terms of social media today. But the last little thing I want to talk about is mechanical consciousness, which is ticket thinking. And he once described it as, he said, oh, once someone in the US asked me, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And the idea of that was that all his human complexity was being reduced down to a singular concept. And so again, in terms of structure and the production of reified consciousness, you can actually take this framework I've been talking about the Khmer Rouge party line, and reformulate it. So you can take the fuel framework I mentioned before, but I just want to, I have about 1.5 minutes left to return to the last component of my presentation about framing. And again, I began purposely by saying, what do you see? Because I was presenting Duch in a frame and you were reading, as we all do, meanings onto that frame. So again, what is a frame, right? It's an interpretive structure that's more or less directive. And as it gets more directive, it becomes more a manifestation of ticket or mechanical thinking, to use Adorno's phrasing. So the book cover is actually a frame as well. Man or Monster is the caption that the graphic artist used to frame the book. And I discussed the cover in depth in the text and talked about the Khmer script and Buddhist meanings that are read by many Cambodians versus the word evil, which is right there at the center. That was written by someone in English, and it frames Duch differently depending on how you're reading it. So these frames can be more or less directive. And in the book, I talk about thick frames of power. And again, the thicker the frames of power, the more it promotes ticket thinking and reified consciousness. And the thickest frame of power is one that becomes naturalized, where you can't see out of the frame. You don't even realize that you're looking into a frame. And so again, the Khmer Rouge party line, through politics, organization, and consciousness, produce different categories of identity and difference. So if we go back to the Holocaust, and this is from Maus, the slide as well, you can discuss that, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. Here is an example of the Khmer Rouge of producing enemies with politics, organization, consciousness in the context. Again, in the context of the Holocaust, the production of, for example, Jewish identity. You can apply this rubric to discussions of race in the US. You can use it in discussion in relationship to a court of law that produces criminality. You can also use it in terms of ways that Duch was read in terms of Buddhist frames, as I mentioned before, by people in Cambodia. So I pretty much got through everything I wanted to talk about, but again, I wanted to end with this notion of the frame as an example, both of reified consciousness as it's structured by power, and it's also ticket thinking. And I want to, besides mentioning Adorno, to loop back to Arendt and her discussion of Eichmann, and talking about Eichmann in terms of sheer thoughtlessness. A lot of people read Banality of Evil as solely being about bureaucratic, desk bureaucrats functioning, but in fact, for Arendt, it was all about a failure to think. And so she dovetails and nicely converges with Adorno on that point. And I, in Manner Monster, propose another framework, sort of reworking Arendt a little bit to talk about the banality of everyday thought. So again, what do you see now? We began with the first question about Duch, what do you see? And now when I pose the question, what do you see now? How is Duch being framed? And I will end there. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take some questions if you have them.